Good morning, fellow heathens. Good afternoon to those of us here in South Africa. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the woman, the legend, Godless Granny.
Hello, Dean. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Hey, I
uh,
have a question for you right off the bat.
yeah.
I always play the stream that I'm in simultaneously. So I just tabbed over from your channel, and I see that you have 666 subscribers. And I'm wondering if that is intentional and you want to keep it that way, or if you want to grow it.
No, we definitely want to grow it. But it's interesting. I also saw the comment. I was going to mention it. Yeah, that's very yeah, very interesting. I'm glad to see our usual crew of viewers here. But this is all about our favorite granny. I've been following you for a while on YouTube, and I simply love your content. You just have such a way of approaching these, especially the religious streams that you do, where you dissect the Bible and the things. You do it in a very, very succinct and insightful way that I find very endearing. I love to watch those streams particularly. But
Well,
let's
thank
talk.
you. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. But let's talk about your background, Granny. Did you grow up in religion at all? What was the?
Not really. When I was very young, my parents were Catholic, but
Oh
my
yeah,
parents left the Catholic Church when I was 7, and they
right,
left over the issue of birth control. Back in the 60s, the Catholic Church was still adamant that you do not use birth control. And so my parents, after having 4 kids, said, this is all we want. So something's got to go, either the church or the marriage. And we don't want to give up the marriage. So goodbye, church. And so from that point, I was raised secular. Although
right,
it's kind of funny because my mom always kind of sort of Catholic.
right,
She could never completely let go of the indoctrination. And so she said, I don't believe there is a God, but if there is a God, it's the Catholic God. I don't
right.
believe in any religion, but if there is a religion, it's Catholic religion because that's the one true religion. Um,
Right. It's funny how that works. The one true religion always happens to be the one that you were born into.
right, right, right.
Very interesting. What was your personal journey of deconversion from religion like?
Well,
What were
okay, let me tell you a little bit, just very briefly, how I got into it. And that was when I was in school at 16. I don't know if you're old enough to remember the I Found It movement back in the 70s.
uh,
Um,
no, I was born in '74, so
okay, okay. So
yeah,
but this was the late 70s, because I was in high school. And so through that movement, there was a kid that sat in my English class that told me about the Bible, and he said something that caught me, and that was, he said, "There's something missing from your life, and that something is God. And if you just trust in God, then you'll be able to fill that missing part in your life." And so I thought he had some kind of insight. I didn't realize that, all Christians say this. And, so I believed, and I was an avid believer. I mean, I was there, every Sunday and Wednesday. If the church doors were open, I was there. I sang in the choir. I was on committees. I taught VBS. I taught ladies' Bible study in my home. Um, at one church, I started a church library from scratch. Um, I had every position that I could, and about the only positions I never had were pastor, because being a woman, I wasn't allowed to be a pastor. And I never taught adult Sunday school that had men in it because women were not allowed to teach men.
it sounds like it was a bit of a it has a bit of a fundamentalist flavor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Definitely not progressive at all.
I went to a number of different churches because my husband was active duty Army and we moved around a lot.
Right.
We went to evangelical free churches when we were in Wisconsin, but before he got into the Army. But once he got in the Army, they moved us south, and the Evangelical Free Church is a small denomination that's located mostly in the northern states. And so there were no evangelical free churches where we were. So we went to the Baptist church, which was very similar. And
The
then,
Baptists are down the line.
yeah, yeah. And then a couple decades later, I was convinced that Calvinism was a more accurate theology. So then we moved to a Calvinist church. And then when we moved away from Fort Wayne, Indiana, um, it's actually somewhat difficult to find a Calvinist church where I am in Alabama, at least the kind of church I was looking for. So we ended up at the Presbyterian Church, which is Calvinist.
It's only upon reflection that I realized, isn't it strange that there's so many different versions of the truth?
Yes. Yes.
We have that truth.
And the way I put it is, if only there was some kind of a God out there that would let people know which one is real.
Yeah, that's right. The question I asked before I forgot to ask you about the rest of your journey in Christianity was the straw that broke the camel's back. Was it a gradual process? Because the most common story we hear is it was a gradual process of basically carrying a heavy load and unpacking it as you go. There's very few people who have that aha moment where the clouds open and
I am one of them. I am one of them.
Oh.
There was it was almost to me it felt like it was instantaneous.
Right,
but when I started listening to other people's journeys, I realized that there were building blocks that led up to it. But for me, I'll start with the aha moment, and then, no, I'll start 2 weeks before, because the major shift, the major crack came 2 weeks before the aha moment. And the major crack came when I was reflecting on the life of the Apostle Paul. And I thought about, why did Jesus appear to Paul? Well, obviously, because, God knew what a great follower Paul would be, and what great things he would do for the faith. And so God wanted him. And that's why God appeared to him, because he wanted him. Well, okay. So if God doesn't give a person what they need to know in order to believe, does that mean he doesn't want them? Well, the Calvinist faith says no, he doesn't, that God calls the elect, and God only wants those that he calls.
Yeah.
And I had accepted that. But when I started reflecting on it from this perspective, I started realizing, wait a minute, that means God made people he doesn't want. These people were, and even though I'd always known that according to that faith, the vast majority of humanity was predestined to hell, I never really thought about them. I only thought about those of us in the in-group. I never thought about the out-group. And this was a major thing for me, was thinking about, well, what about all those people that are going to hell? Why doesn't God reach out to them? And I've suddenly realized that, if God wanted them, if he's omniscient, he certainly knows what it is that's keeping them from believing. He could tell them, and it wouldn't have to be a personal appearance. It would be just whatever that person particularly needs. And it's in his power to do it. So why doesn't he?
It would be the kind and loving thing to do.
Right. And so I came to this realization that God cannot be omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, and have the vast majority of people predestined to going to hell. It just didn't work. So I shifted to universalism. And I kind of came up with the idea that, well, okay, the Bible tells us what happens in this life. It tells us almost nothing about the afterlife. And so I came to think that, it probably is true that once you die, that you come before God and he will explain everything for you. He will lay the whole thing out for you. And then he'll give you the option. Would you like to be with me, or would you rather burn in hell for eternity? and then people get an informed choice. That lasted for about 2 weeks. And it was at that my son, who at that time was 18 or 17, 18, it was right around his birthday. I guess he had just turned 18. He had been an unbeliever for a while. And I put all of my children in Christian school, and my son was just about to graduate from high school from Westminster Christian Academy, and I knew my son wasn't a believer anymore. And my son was extremely nervous. Months away from I knew about 6 months away from graduation that he wasn't a believer anymore. He was terrified of being found out and being expelled from school for being an unbeliever. And so he was trying to keep his unbelief to himself. And so shortly after he graduated, which was a complete relief, we were like, good, we got the diploma in hand. Now it doesn't matter if people know what we believe. So then he said, Mom, Noah's Ark never happened. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, for one thing, the poop, the methane gas that came from the poop would have killed all of the animals. And I said, nah, I'm sure that wouldn't be the case.
They had windows. Come on.
Well, I knew that the ark only had one window. One thing is, I do know the Bible very well. I mean, I've read it cover to cover 5 times. And I memorized the book of 1 John. I've memorized, lots of passages of scripture. And I read my Bible every day. I know the Bible well. So I knew there was only one window. But then I looked it up online, and I found a couple different websites that confirmed what my son said to me. And I was, okay, well, I don't know the answer to that. Then my son showed me a video. It was Aaron Ra at the Ark protest. And Aaron Ra said, we know the flood didn't happen. We know this from biology, geology, history. And that was the aha moment when he said the word history. Because suddenly, for the first time, I thought about the fact that I know from studying history that there were people in China that lived at the time of the alleged flood.
Many people.
And they didn't die. Their civilization just kept right on going.
Yeah.
And suddenly, for the first time, I put that together. I had never thought about that in light of the fact that the flood was supposed to have happened and supposed to have killed him. And so at that moment, I realized that it wasn't true. Okay.
Yeah.
So why does this one thing being untrue collapse the whole faith? And here's why. Now you have to go back 35 years. In 1984, I had a stillborn child. And when that happened, I examined my faith very carefully. How could a loving God kill a child? And I came away from that still a believer. And obviously, I continued to believe for another 35 years. But what I did in that process was I identified the foundation of my faith. And I identified it as sola scriptura. And I said, as long as the Bible is true, I will always hold to this. So fast forward 35 years, once I realized just one thing in the Bible wasn't true, the whole foundation of my faith was now gone.
Yeah, it's like a house of cards. That's
Exactly.
A house of cards, a house of lies, whatever you want to. As soon as you pull one out, the whole thing comes crumbling down.
Yep.
It's very interesting that you talk about Noah's flood, because I was always interested in knowing about the mathematics of it, because we know how much water is in existence, more or less. We can calculate the volume of a sphere, and we can do the math to subtract, from ocean level up to the tallest mountain, which was apparently, according to the book, submerged. And there is not enough water in existence to do that. And then you get the tap dancing. No, well, okay, the water of the deep burst forth. And but then the weight of the water would compress and crush the earth beneath it. So it's funny how people can rationalize and justify the most absurd things.
Mhm.
You speak to Muslims, for example, they will they they will bet their firstborn children on the fact that there is a winged horse that flew the prophet to to heaven, and because it's written in the Quran, it's true. And it never ceases to amaze me how ass backwards this kind of reasoning and thinking is, where it starts with the conclusion and then rationalizes itself down to down to the book. But I was there. I was one of the people who believed that. So
How long were you a believer?
I was born into a family that were nominally Christian.
Mhm.
Um, in my teenage years, my mother lost her taste for going to church altogether. So
Mm.
I was just born into it, and I mean, I still believed it until in my up until my early 20s, when I started to have serious doubts about it.
Mm.
When I left my mother's home to go and do my own thing, I moved to another city, and the city happened to have a big population of Hindu people in it. It's based on the eastern coast of South Africa, and this was the very first time in my life that I encountered a religion different to the one that I grew up in. I mean, I grew up in apartheid era South Africa. We were very insulated. We were insulated in terms of what we were exposed to. I only know of one particular type of religion. And then as soon as my horizons opened up, I said to myself, well, wait a minute. Here's another religion, and they've got a completely different God to mine. But they can't both be true at the same time.
Mhm.
And and then I said to myself, but they can both be wrong at the same time.
Mm. Mhm.
And that was my straw. And I still, I lost my taste for Christianity altogether in my late 20s. And then I went through, they say the road to atheism is paved with deist stones, you know,
I've not heard that one.
where, well, you say to yourself, well, Christianity definitely cannot be true. So there's got to be something else, there's got to be some spirit in the wind, or some primal first cause, or whatever. And you try to rationalize and justify just letting go, because it's a traumatic experience to let go of religion. You do experience trauma in certain, it might not be in ways that you physically express, but it has a traumatic effect on your psyche, where you have to cope with it. It's almost like losing someone to death. You go through a period of grief and of mourning, and then only later on you find acceptance. But
One
I'll be turning 50 next month, and it was, I'd say, towards around 35. Around 35, I just let it all go. I just said, look, this is just, it's too much hassle to try and keep track of all the gods.
one of the biggest surprises for me in leaving Christianity was what I needed, and that was I needed new clothes. Because almost every T-shirt I owned was either from some church event or had some kind of Christian slogan on it. And so when I didn't believe anymore, I said, "I'm gonna have to get all new T-shirts."
Well, what does it say? New year, new you. um, I really love the fact that you've created this little corner on YouTube for yourself, and that you've cultivated this regular viewership. What it, are you involved in any kind of activism in person, or is it do you mainly focus on
I mainly focus on my channel. I do pay a little bit of attention to what's going on in the transgender community.
Right,
My son is transgender,
right,
and I need to be more active in what's going on in legislation. The problem is that these bills don't come up very often, and
right.
when they do, the capital is a 3-hour drive from here. So
Mm,
I need to know when it's coming up far enough in advance to plan a trip down there to go
right,
protest or something.
right, right.
And usually I'm not getting the information at the right time. I
Yeah.
did find one place on Facebook where I could get information about what's going on, but that group is so active, it just bombards me with information that's useless that I can't get what I need.
You just you say that I just want a calendar. Can somebody please just send me a calendar?
Right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, it's funny. Those of us who are a little bit older, we have this idea of activism as a picket line outside of a big corporate entity, people shouting with placards. But the kids these days, they do activism in so many different ways, and I've only recently discovered that you can make a much bigger impact online than you could ever do having 10 people standing outside a corporate head office. So
Mhm.
I think the whole face of activism is changing, and simply by unifying ourselves in communities of people who have a voice and leave an imprint, even on social media or whatever. That's a very powerful form of activism, because that changes minds. Where I think sometimes the physical protest inconveniences people more than it changes their minds.
I also do some of my activism just in the clothes that I wear. I'm rather picky about what my clothes say, and
Yeah,
I have a shirt that has a pride flag on it, and it
right.
says ally. And I wore that when I was traveling once with my husband, and it was really interesting. We were going through LaGuardia Airport, and it was very crowded. And suddenly I saw that a man that had been going up the stairs in the opposite direction of us turn around and go down against the crowd to come over to me. And he obviously was gay. And then he said to me, "Thank you for being an ally." And I realized not only did he notice the shirt, but it moved him enough that he fought the crowd to get to me to
Yeah,
tell me thank you for being an ally.
yeah, yeah. It's true. It's true that sometimes we focus so much on just having that immediate impact on people that we don't realize that this conversation that we're having now, maybe 3-4 years down the line, somebody who's in a moment of doubt is going to see it, and they're gonna say, look at these two people, they're not brides of Satan plotting to roast babies on a Sunday afternoon, and what they say really makes sense.
Mhm, mhm.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
one of the things that I like to do is Frank Turek and Ray Comfort and a few of the others claim that the only reason people deconvert is because they want to sin,
yeah,
and it's usually sex. They're usually gay or something, and so when people hear that I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, they tell me, "Well, that's it. You just want to sin." I said, "Please tell me what is it I'm doing that's sin." They said, "Well, you're gay," and I said, "No, I'm not gay." They said, "Well, you're
yeah,
trans." "No, I'm not trans." "Well, then what are you?" I said, "I'm asexual."
right.
"Please tell me how being asexual causes me to sin."
I don't know, Granny. I don't understand what the obsession. Christians, especially, have this obsession with what other people do in their bedrooms with
Yes.
their private time, and I don't know whether it comes from the literature or whether it comes from the whole culture of repression that stems from the literature. But there is definitely this element of the taboo, sexuality, talking about sexuality, even the female form is completely taboo. because you'll be tempted by lust, and and it forces people to live these lives that are so completely against our nature. We are primates by nature, and we have this communal vibe going between us. And you look at primates in nature; they are you don't want to go there, because I think the pearl clutchers and the Bible punchers will lose their mind if humanity had the nature of true primates in the wild. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about the negative impact that religion has on society. Mentioned it a little bit earlier, where we talked about the psychological impact that religion has on people. Have you experienced any kind of negative impact? I know that in your neck of the woods, the religious folk really tried to legislate their religion into law, and that obviously causes a lot of human rights violations here
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in our country, in our continent especially. um, Religion has a very, very harmful effect on people. There's from cults to um, you know the abuse of women, especially in the north of Africa. That the other Christianity's sister religion, Islam, is has a horrible track record when it comes to the rights of women, which is like half of the population. It's 50% of the human race, right there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the reason I ask this is because especially on the atheist news feeds that you read, there's always some kooky Christian or trying to enact a bill to legislate something out of existence. Um,
I've seen it both on a community-wide scale and on a personal scale.
right.
You're probably well aware of the community, so I'll focus a little bit more on the personal, and that is, yeah, I told you about how I could never teach. I can't preach, I can't speak in
Yeah.
church because I'm a woman. Although we were allowed to read a Bible passage, that was permitted. We could give testimony, that was permitted, but we couldn't preach. And so, we always violated the woman can't speak. You kind of pick and choose the verses that you
Mm,
like.
mm,
Our church
mm.
also didn't care about women covering their heads, although there were a couple of women in the congregation that said, no, the Bible says you have to have your head covered. I'm going to cover my head. And so they'd always wear a scarf or something on top of their head. Oh, along those lines, before I get to the big thing, when I was very young, the Catholic Church was also into, women had to have their heads covered. And I remember one time going to church as a very young child and hearing the little girl behind me wanting to take her hat off. And back in the 60s, we wore those little straw hats that had those elastic chin straps. And those chin straps were awful. They were so itchy, they were so uncomfortable. And so this little girl wanted to take her hat off, and her mom says, "No, you're in church. You can't take your hat off." And the little girl pointed to me and says, "That little girl isn't wearing a hat." And her mom said, "Well, she has a bow in her hair, so that's okay." And I'm like, how legalistic we were that you put a bow on your head, so there, your head is covered. So the little girl said, "Quick, mom, give me your purse. Let me put your purse on my head." Unfortunately, we were too little to think of that. Uh, but as for me personally, the real serious issue was, that I was supposed to be subject to my husband at all times. And if he wanted something and it wasn't what I wanted, then I was to subject my wants and desires to what he wanted because he was the man.
Mm,
And I did. And in one part of our life, this caused serious problems.
mm.
because what he wanted in the bedroom and what I wanted in the bedroom were not the same.
mm, mm,
And so I just shut up and did whatever he wanted.
mm,
And that caused me so much distress that the only way that I could live with it was to try to convince myself that I am not a person.
mm,
He's the person, so we do what he wants. And so I would get up in the morning and tell myself, I have no wants, I have no desires, I have no thoughts, I have no feelings. I am not a person. And I went through doing that for quite some time until it finally broke, and I finally told I can't do this anymore.
mm, mm. Yeah, it's a the way that it teaches us to absolutely devalue ourselves.
Mhm.
We are taught that we are filth, we are not worthy of love, that we are not worthy of being recognized. And the second you let religion go, you just say to yourself, fuck that, and you stand in your own power, and you realize all of these lies that have been told by people who actually have your best interests at heart. And I went through the phase where I was so angry. I was fuming. When I when I let the whole thing go finally. About a week later, I was searing mad because I just said to myself, like, "Okay, what's wrong with the world? Why can't people see that they're feeding everybody else all this nonsense, and look at all the harm that it does?" And then that simmered down, and it the pot of lava became a hot broth, and then after a hot broth it cooled down some more, and then then I said to myself, look, if you don't apply some other principles here, this is going to consume you. You have to look at this with compassion and empathy. And I looked at how, I just flipped the script, and I said to myself, when I was in that position, I was doing this out of a genuine desire to help people and to
Mhm.
lift people up. So what was forced on me was not done in malice. It was definitely not malicious or with the intent to hurt me. It had the unfortunate consequence of inflicting all of these programming into me, and even after all these years, a decade and a half later, I still find myself, those things are so deeply imprinted in my psyche. Sometimes I'll find myself in a specific relationship with another person, and these things pop up, and it's sort of like, fuck, religion, you really left, you really left a deep scar. The cut is healed, but the scar is the scar is
I
still there.
I didn't go through that phase,
Yeah,
and I think part of it is because I was duped for so long. I
right.
mean, I was a believer for 42 years, and
Yeah.
so when people believe, I look, you just don't know yet. And what I have found absolutely phenomenal is all of the things that I've learned since I left the faith, which was not even quite 5 years ago.
Mm,
So much of what I believed was just absolute bullshit, but I didn't know that. And so I have more compassion for people who still believe just because I think you just don't know yet.
yeah. Yeah. That's true. So, what would you say to a younger version of yourself? If you could stop time now and maybe go back 10 or 20 years, what would you say to a younger version of
I
yourself?
would definitely tell myself the history thing because if someone had said that to me, it would have changed things way back because
Yeah,
and that's something that I've brought up to believers, and it's they never answer that question. They always dodge it. I asked them, okay, following the Tower of Babel, when these all these Babylonian people who are now speaking different languages are dispersing around the world. So a group of them went to China. They excavated the civilization that was there before the flood. They studied their art, their pottery, their literature, and they copied it. First question, how? Second question, why?
Yeah. Yeah.
We want to be just like these people who used to live here.
But the thing is also, when you look at now from the outside looking in, we can understand how this happened. This was an isolated community in the Middle East who had no clue about China, no clue about South America. They had no idea that Africa like Africa south of the equator even existed.
Okay.
So when when they didn't go beyond the desert. So the desert was the Great Wall that separated them from the rest of Africa. But it's funny that is what you expect. When you read the Bible with this in mind, that's what you expect to find, and it's rather telling. It's rather telling.
One thing that's interesting is I have learned a great deal from Bart Ehrman about the Bible, and he is the foremost scholar when it comes to New Testament criticism in the world. And when I was a believer, Bart Ehrman was absolutely taboo. Do not read anything by Bart Ehrman. He's an unbeliever. He doesn't know the truth. So there's no sense in reading the works of someone who doesn't know what's true. And that is why I was so isolated in the faith for so long, is I didn't read anything because it was, anything by an unbeliever, because, hey, if they don't know the very first building block of what is truth, then anything they have to say can't possibly be of any value.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. You can think of the analogy of children. It's if you raise children in an overprotected environment where you don't expose them to, for example, outside influences, and you keep them sheltered. The second they get exposed to the outside world, they just run amok. They run amok completely. And the same thing happened with me, for example, is when the second I recognized the other aspects of, that there were other religions, and that the world was much bigger than this little Dutch Reformed Afrikaans community that I grew up in. I just went like, wow, you people don't know shit. And I let bolt. And the thing is, it's a control mechanism. That's what religion is used as, a control mechanism. And sorry, you were going to say?
I was saying Dutch Reform. So you were Calvinist also.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Granny, don't ask me about church, because I think if I set foot in a church now, I'll probably spontaneously burst into flames.
Oh.
I haven't set foot in a church except for a funeral.
Weddings and funerals. I still go to weddings and funerals.
Even weddings, I don't bother to go to the service. I just go to the reception.
Well, my niece and nephew got married fairly recently, so I was in church for those. Although it's really funny because my sister had a fit because I wore an atheist t-shirt the day before the wedding. And I invited you down here as my guest for the weekend. It's like, yeah, but you didn't control me for the weekend. I mean, I was just out sightseeing in the city. It wasn't like I was at a wedding event.
The invitation didn't have a dress code. Sorry.
Right. And all the t-shirt I was wearing said was, "What's up, heathens? How y'all doing?" It was Godless Engineer.
I've been watching John's content for a long time. He's got such an infectious sense of humor and personality, and it's very, very endearing. Very endearing.
John lives in the same city that I do.
Oh, wow.
One thing interesting, that particular T-shirt is a collector's item because there's somebody that claims to have copyrighted the phrase "What's up, heathens?" and
Uh,
so sent him a cease and desist order that doesn't allow him to sell that T-shirt. I think that if he fought that in court, he could win. However,
yeah,
the cost for him to do that would be greater than what he would get from being able to continue selling T-shirts. So
yeah, that's
he's
true.
he's stopped selling that shirt, but I still have one.
Interesting, interesting. Um, let's talk a little bit about the fallout zone around your atheism, Granny. What was the reaction like from? Because obviously you were in a community of believers, and those around you, like you said, you were very involved. What was the fallout like when you
There
deconverted?
actually wasn't a whole lot, and a big part of that is because I had been very active in a church, and it was a Baptist church. But I really was upset at some things that were going on in the church. Part of it was due to Donald Trump.
Right,
Um, his rise to power brought out a lot of bigotry in the people around me. But the thing that sent me from the church was the pastor. In the pulpit, the pastor was ridiculing unbelievers and asking us to bring unbelievers to church. And I said, if you want me to bring unbelievers to your church, then you can't get up there in the pulpit and ridicule them. Um,
right, right.
and I just found him so hypocritical in that, he claims to want to love and reach out to the outside community, but then he also makes fun of them. And I really did not see that as a good way to do it. So I left that church and I started going to another Presbyterian church. And the Presbyterian church I started going to was a very small church. And we were only there for 4 or 5 months before my deconstruction came. And so we hadn't gotten to the point where I was really into it. I had asked about singing in the choir, but the choir was off for a couple of months, because it was such a small church. And they were going to be starting back up in a few months. And so, okay, I was going to join them when we got there. Um, for the first time, we weren't going to Sunday school. I think I know that my son was starting to get uncomfortable with some of this stuff because I knew he didn't really believe it all. So for the first time, we were just going to church and that's it. So there was kind of a lessening for those months, but because I never got really into this church, when I stopped going altogether, nobody said a word. In fact, as we were going to this church, that pivot that I took to universalism, my husband and I asked the pastor to dinner, and she was a woman, which some Presbyterian churches don't even allow women pastors, but this one did. And I asked her some questions that were bothering me about the faith, but I wasn't yet in a position where I could really articulate what was bothering me. And she did not get from the questions that I was asking her that I was at a serious crisis of faith. And so the answers she gave me were incomplete. Well, of course they were incomplete. There are no answers to these questions. And she offered me nothing as something to hang on to the faith. And
Right.
so when the aha moment came, the support was already gone.
Exactly. Granny, when I look back now, I, the only way that I can think of religion is like artificial sweetener. you know, that's all it is. It's you go through life and you can bite into a authentic piece of sugarcane and you can savor that sweetness on your mouth, and then religion just steps in and hands you this artificial sweetener. It's you can taste it's not the real thing. It's saccharine, and it's just not the same thing. I don't know. very weird. Let's see. I have so many questions, but I want to be mindful of your time and our viewers' time as well. So I'm going to select maybe two more questions, and
Sure, no problem.
then we will wrap it up. Let me
Before
just.
you get to that, I'm not sure how you say it. Bolalang was talking a bit about some of Bart Ehrman's works, and I would say if you only read one book of his, I would read Forged. That one had a huge impact on me.
Yeah. I will look for that title. You can, if you send me a message with a title, I'll put it in the description,
Okay.
and we can link viewers to it there. What was I gonna go here? Okay, yes. This idea of we just want to sin, and like atheists are just mad at God and angry at God, but people don't realize that typically there is a process of intense study and intense self-examination that accompanies this deconversion, and during that period of study and investigation, a lot of people turn to science and more plausible and believable explanations for nature and the universe, because we are beyond the age where religion can claim to know everything about the origin of the universe. I mean, there are very few people, there are some, but there are very few people left on the planet who believe in literally 6,000 years ago, God said poof, and then it was Mudman and Rib Woman and the snake in the garden and the zoo boat and the incest. And, so did science and, reason play a role for you in your deconversion? Did you find these kind of scientific explanations and the way that we understand the workings of the universe more compelling than the religious explanations about the nature of the universe and human existence?
The first thing I found was that I was woefully ignorant when it came to science. The fact that I didn't even know that Noah's Ark didn't happen, tells you how woefully ignorant I was. And so as soon as I quit believing, I started checking out Aaron Ra's content, and I couldn't even understand it. The vocabulary was, I couldn't understand the vocabulary. So my son introduced me to a number of atheist content creators, and two of the others that he recommended were Vice Rhino and Apologia. Vice Rhino, I could understand for the most part. There were a few concepts that he was getting to that were still over my head, but Paulogia I could really relate to. I've since met Paulogia, and he and I both have a very similar background, and so he was very easy for me to relate to. And as he would explain things, I then started developing the vocabulary to understand what Vice Rhino was talking about. And then I developed the vocabulary to understand what Aaron Ra was talking about. It's funny, I went through Aaron Ra's phylogeny challenge, and I had a real problem listening to the first 3 episodes because, I swear I looked up the meaning of the word eukaryote 5 times because I'd never heard that word before. And I didn't know what a eukaryote was, and he kept talking about eukaryotes. And and a big part of it was, as I'm a lawyer and working in law and in the insurance industry, I had no use for all these scientific concepts.
Right.
In college, as an undergrad, I knew that I wasn't going into a science field. So the only science classes I took in college were Biology 101, and I took Chemistry 101 for non-science majors, which was a really fun class. We didn't learn a lot of chemistry, but we did learn how to make brandy and how to make wine and how to make nylon.
Money well spent.
Yes. So when it comes to hard science, the last course that I had was Biology 101 in 1979. And so I had this huge gap in knowledge. And it was funny listening to Erica Gutsick Gibbon saying, guys, this is freshman level stuff. You know, Ardipithecus ramadan was discovered, and I'm going, I don't even know what an Ardipithecus ramadan is. And I looked it up and I saw it was discovered in the mid 80s. I was like, well, no wonder I'd never heard of it. I haven't had a science course since 1979. And
Yeah,
yeah, there were some huge gaps in my knowledge.
yeah, yeah. No, and I mean the more that we that we discover about the natural world, I think that gap where religion gets slotted into as a plausible explanation just shrinks and keeps shrinking and keeps shrinking, and the process of that gap where religion used to fit very well in, that gap shrinking is causing believers especially a lot of anxiety and distress, because the more we discover, I mean, when we start discovering how solar systems formed in the Big Bang, and when we get to that level, then there's going to be another, they're going to move the goal, they're going to have to keep on moving the goalposts back and back and back, and it's going to get to a point where that fear and insecurity cause people to they either lose their belief or they become very horrible people to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
They become like creationists. I could never.
And flat earthers, just completely
Yeah,
denying what comes out.
I know, but the thing about flat earthers is 99.99999% of them are super religious.
Mm-hmm.
They're super religious, and it's a rationalization. Where's that? There's a line in the Bible that says, if this is true, something about this is a lie, and this, if this is a lie, then nothing is true, or something along the verse.
You might be thinking of the one, if Christ is not raised, then we of all people are the most to be pitied.
Exactly. That's the one, and that leads people to believe that if anything in the book is wrong or proven wrong, then the whole thing collapses. And
right.
And
Ken Ham used to have a sign in his creation museum, or the Ark Encounter, that said, if I can, it had the snake wrapped around the sign, and said, if I can prove to you the flood didn't happen, then I can prove to you then that the whole Bible didn't happen. And there's a video of Aaron Ra in front of that sign where he says, well, I wouldn't put the bar that low. And, and I looked at that and I just laughed, because I did. That's exactly where the bar was for me. If you can prove just one point isn't true, the whole thing fell.
Yeah, that's crazy. Right. Did you encounter any positive aspects of personal growth since you've let religion go?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The biggest one is I'm not depressed the way I was. I suffered from depression for years and years and years as a believer. And one thing that I kind of kept secret, there were very few people that knew about it, but I wanted to die so badly. Anytime I went to a funeral, I was absolutely jealous of the person in the coffin, because I wanted to die and go be with God, where life was going to be bliss forever. And I knew that wasn't the way you're supposed to think. So I usually didn't tell people, but that's how I thought. And now, for the first time, I can focus on life. I don't have to wait for death to be happy. I can focus on life. And that's why my theme is live your life.
I love that. That's the way that you always sign off. You always sign off with that, and you're going to sign off. You're going to sign us out today as well. But in conclusion, I would just like to, on behalf of our little group of atheists here in South Africa, thank you for waking up so early and for being so incredibly generous with your time. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting you and sharing your journey. I will post the links to your channel in the description of this video if anybody wants to go and check out your channel. You can tell us a little bit about your channel in conclusion, what people can expect to find there. And then I ask that you sign us off with your with your classic line.
I will do that. Okay. My channel is Godless Granny. I focus a lot on religion and anti-theism. I do dabble some in politics. As I mentioned, I am a trans parent. I have a transgender son, so I am adamant about transgender rights, rights for the LGBTQ community, empowering women. But all of these tie together into the religion because these are things that were repressed from me when I was in the religion. Although the transgender issue that did not come out until after I had deconverted. My son did not transition until after I was already an atheist. So yeah, I tend to look at what apologists are saying and point out why what they are saying just simply isn't true. Live your life.
Thank you, Granny.